Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
Welcome to Crosspointe.
We are an inclusive faith community
seeking to live out the loving, just, and generous way of Jesus.
We are participants in a long tradition.
It's less concerned with doctrines and dogma that demand total agreement,
but a life to be lived, enjoyed, and given away to others.
What unites us is a growing awareness that life is precious.
That we are made by love in order to love.
This community is comprised of and affirms the entire human family,
regardless of race, age, creed,
physical abilities, marital or economic status,
gender identity, or sexual orientation.
So, if you're curious and have come to see,
if you are tired and have come to rest,
if you are grateful and have come to share,
if you are wounded and have come to heal,
if you're joyful and have come to celebrate,
if you are uprooted and have come to belong,
welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
Welcome home.
It was breath that filled our lungs, and every breath we breathe in love, we breathe in life, we breathe in you, God. So take a breath and breathe in deep. Listen now to your heartbeat. Every heartbeat, we breathe in you, God. Oh, the beauty of this love that holds us all together. The wonder of this land. Hearts that you have nurtured. Can we know this love that you have offered? Oh, let us breathe. We have a home, a sign of comfort. We have a chance to love each other, one another, to love like you, God. Oh, the beauty of this love that holds us all together. The wonder of this land, the hearts that you have nurtured. Can we know this love that can we know this love that you have offered? Oh, let us breathe love. Oh, let us breathe love.
Hey, good morning, Crosspointe. Really hope you're doing well today. So I don't have a lot of pressing announcements to make you aware of today. So I thought I would take a moment to just share with you a tension that we're always wrestling with around here as leaders at Crosspointe, especially when it comes to what we all contribute financially, and especially during this pandemic. Now, before I go any farther, I just want to let you know there's no pressure coming. There's no big sacrificial ask, something that we all need to lean into heavily, none of that. This is just something philosophical, but I think it's important that we name it, because we've always just tried to be upfront around here and name tensions when they come up. And so here's the challenge. When you're at church, one of the things that makes people tend to cringe is any talk of asking for money, and I totally get that. And a lot of the reason behind that is how many of us have been exposed to churches and how they maybe sometimes have used guilt or shame or manipulative tactics to make people feel like that they have some sort of obligation to contribute financially to the church. And that if they do, then somehow they'll get some sort of special healing or forgiveness or some tangible blessing from God, or just stave off God's disappointment. And in my 16 years here at Crosspointe, we've always avoided that kind of language and tactics, and we've just tried to always call it gross, because that's what it is. But then when you look at how a typical nonprofit that's not a church raises money, most of the time, the best way that you'll find that they do that is by sharing stories, by seeing people on camera that our contributions impact and that we get to experience those emotional moments. And the thing is, I love those kinds of stories, right? I get moved greatly by those kinds of stories when I get to see them, when I get to hear them. I think most of us do. However, there's this fine line we're always wrestling with as leaders here at the church. Because while there's so many amazing stories of generosity and life change that happen throughout this church community that can be great to share, we also never want to exploit people in their situation to make them feel like that they owe us in some way, that somehow there's strings attached and that they need to share their story with all of us. So for instance, in the past 3 weeks, with now more than 20 different people that we've been able to significantly help financially, I talked about this last week, with rent and with medical bills to help keep a roof over their head and food on the table. A small part of me wants to take a video camera to their home and ask them to look at the camera and speak directly to all of you and to express their gratitude, because I know the good emotional hit that is for all of us. But the bigger part of us as leaders doesn't ever want to exploit their situation, right? We don't want to ever violate their privacy in what is often a very humbling and difficult circumstance. Now, if someone wants to share their story and they want to express their gratitude, I'm all for that. And I love that. But I hope you can understand why we never press people for that, as we try to honor and love really well, even though it may and does come at the expense of all of us getting to hear the specifics of all the time. And I know as a staff, we can feel that same pressure too at times, where there's this natural curiosity from people wondering, hey, I know you guys write some teachings every so often, but what else do you do during the week? Maybe you've wondered that. And if so, that's a perfectly normal thing to wonder about. The reality is, I don't know what probably most of you do day to day in your jobs. But again, here's where stories become a challenge. Because if I was to try to explain that we met and walked with 7 couples this past week who were battling significant addictions and affairs and gut-wrenching brokenness in their relationships, and we as a staff spent hours with 2 adults and 3 teenagers that were contemplating and or attempted suicide in the past week, and that we walked with their loved ones and their families who had to navigate their own challenges with that, And then we met with and counseled 5 other people who had family relationships blow up as they had this crisis of faith on their own, where so much of what they heard growing up about faith and about God no longer made any sense to them. And then we sat with a couple more people as they experienced this deep grief and loss. You see, those aren't stories that are wise to share for obvious reasons, to get into the specifics of what actually went on with each of those stories. And if people thought that we broadcast their story, they very likely wouldn't come to us for help in the first place. That creating a safe place for people to be gut level honest is one of the best gifts we can offer. And so hopefully you can understand the opposing tensions that have to be managed there. Because obviously we're a nonprofit and we raise money in order to fund all that we do together. And yet we also want to love people incredibly well. And not only that, but just by the nature of what we all do together, it's important for us just to realize and remember there's no way for us to measure or to put on some sort of success chart for all of us to celebrate like a giant thermometer how many people have avoided destruction because they were in a loving, safe community. There's no way to measure how many teens didn't become and haven't become overcome with anxiety and depression because they've had trusted adults regularly speaking into their lives. There's no way to measure how many people didn't have to grow up and carry so much of the religious shame, baggage, and warped views of God that many people, and even many of us, had to grow up carrying. And there's no way to measure how many relationships persevered through difficulty and ended up thriving because of the reminders and the encouragement and the guidance they encountered through different relationships here and the different environments here. So I share all that with you primarily to say to all of you who call Crosspointe home, thank you. Thank you for all you do as you participate and as you serve and as you contribute to this community. Thank you to those of you who contribute financially, a percentage of your income every week, every 2 weeks, every month, because you trust in the significant difference that this community makes in people's lives every day. Thank you. I sincerely don't know of another organization that can impact so many different aspects of people's lives as a healthy church community can. I am beyond honored to serve in this community with all of you. And I share all this in the spirit of just wanting to remind us also why philosophically we may not always hear or see about all the specifics of what happens day in and day out as we try to love and serve people shockingly well, but there is always a ton going on. And then lastly, if you're ever willing to share your story of just the difference this community of people has made in your life, I do hope that you'll reach out to us. I hope you'll send us an email. I hope you go to the Contact Us page on the website. There's an option there where it says you can share your story there. Call us, do whatever you want to do, because stories move, inspire, and motivate all of us that call Crosspointe home to keep leaning in together. And it always seems to work out better when those stories are offered freely. So again, thanks for allowing me just to walk through this philosophical tension with all of you. I've always tried to be somebody, and all of us as leaders here, who just say all the things and just try to name it whenever a tension comes up. But as always, if you want to contribute financially to what we're doing together here at Crosspointe, you can go to crosspointe.org/contribute. You can text the word CrosspointeNC to 77977. Love you people. Grace and peace.
Welcome to the heart of God. Breathe deep, beloved. I am bringing everyone in. There's nothing to be afraid of. This is your birthplace. There are no requirements unmet. This is your birthright. No one is refused. Come in, let down, expand. There is more than enough room. Join me in the deep, refreshing, endless, eternal. Wade in and be refreshed. Let your mind untangle. Let your body rest. Let your spirit be at ease. I am this moment, and by waves of love I will reset your cadence. By my current, get you back on course. My touchable representations on earth, I will birth you again, my sons, my daughters, soaked in my love, and bless you, beloved, to stand and emerge, still dripping of the heart of God, as one fluid, hope-restored movement, to alter the environment for the better everywhere you go. Because everywhere you will go, there I am.
Teach me that it all belongs, that everything is sacred. I eat the bread and drink the wine, but help me love my neighbor and show me how to hold this life, 'cause I don't want upside down. Oh, it can be here and now. Oh, I'm seeing it all around, that everything is sacred. The ordinary shines and glows, filled with your intentions. You don't see the lines we draw between secular and sacred. So show me how to hold this life, 'cause I don't want to waste it. No, I don't want to waste it. Heaven is upside down. Oh, it can be here and now. Oh, I'm seeing it all around, that everything is sacred. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is good. Life is a gift and the giver is upside down. Oh, it can be here and now. Oh, I'm seeing it all around, that everything is sacred, that everything is sacred, that everything is sacred.
Hey everybody. If you don't already have your smartphone out, go ahead and pull it out and pull up the notes section on your phone. Or grab a piece of scratch paper and a pencil or a pen. Or you can share your thoughts in just a minute with somebody sitting next to you, or type them into the live chat if you're watching live. What I want you to do is, I'm going to give you a couple of words, and I want you to write down your initial thoughts, feelings, descriptions of what those things are. There's no right or wrong. And then we're going to talk about them a little bit later. What do you think of when you hear the word church? What do you think of when you hear the word Christian? What about the word Christianity? All of these words are going to give you lots of different responses. And you might ask yourself, why? Why do these questions raise these responses in you? And it's going to depend on your personal experience. If we were to gather all of these questions, all of the answers from online and in person and in the future, a lot of them would have similarities, but a lot of them would be unique. And that's because your views on God, on religion, on faith really depend a lot on your personal experience, on how you were raised, on your culture, a lot of different things. And personal experiences are as different and diverse as the number of people on the planet. Hold on to that thought for a little bit. Hold on to those words for a little bit. And I want to tell you a story. It's a story about a religion that began about 2,000 years ago. And it didn't actually start as a religion. It started more as a movement. It was calling for kind of a protest of the status quo way of doing things. It was a counter movement. And it called for social barriers to be broken down. It called for a new type of citizenship, one that didn't require a passport. It called for equity and equality and equally shared authority among men and women and slave and free and rich and poor and from whatever nation or ethnic group you came from. Anyone that came to the movement was welcome and held equal authority. There was no real set doctrine in the beginning of this movement. There was no teachings that had officially been written down, just a bunch of letters and oral traditions that were shared, and different groups of the movement chose which of those they held to be authoritative, and each one of these little groups practiced their version of the movement in very different ways. They did their best to follow the teachings of the person that they followed. But eventually culture and politics were more powerful than the movement's leaders. And so the movement adjusted to become more acceptable and to grow, to be honest. So equality was kind of swallowed up by politics. The movement didn't follow any real traditional beliefs, religious beliefs at that time, like the pagan beliefs and practices. So like many groups and people that didn't fit into the norm and that were misunderstood throughout history, they became kind of the scapegoat for a lot of things. They became the blamed for the decline of the family, for a rise in promiscuity, for cannibalism, for disease, for disasters, for the fall of Rome. And there were years and years of misunderstandings within the movement, persecutions, murders for being a part. But people still joined the movement, even though being a part of it could be a death sentence. The wealthy often funded it, and the disenfranchised, women, slaves, outsiders, foreigners continued to join the movement because of what it promised them. Well, in 165 CE or AD, during the time of Marcus Aurelius, a devastating epidemic hit the Roman Empire. And if you're Googling it, you might search for the Antonine Plague. It was lethal, and it eradicated about 1/4 to 1/3 of the entire population, and it lasted for over 15 years. So imagine COVID, heightened with no scientific explanation for it, lasting for 15 years. To make matters worse, about 70 years later, in 215 CE, after that first epidemic ended, an equally devastating epidemic swept the empire again. Now, sociologists believe that these epidemics were one major reason for the growth of this movement. Now, we know through a lot of different ways that the Romans were pretty smart people. There is a lot of archaeological evidence to suggest that they knew a lot about human anatomy, basic astronomy, things like that. However, at that time, there was no basic understanding of bacteria, of germs. The spread of communicable diseases made no scientific sense at the time. And so when people started asking questions, why is this happening? And their scientists couldn't explain it, they naturally turned to religion for answers. People were asking the same questions that we ask all the time and when bad things happen. Epidemics, pandemics, natural disasters. And you have to understand that the pagan belief of their gods during that time was very transactional. So the gods did something for you, you did something for them. If the gods were angry at you, they would punish you through sickness or disaster. And you made the gods happy through sacrifice, through right living. But none of these things seemed to be working at the time. And so people left the cities. They scattered to avoid getting sick and dying. But for people in the movement, things were looked at a little bit differently. And to be honest, it didn't make sense to the people at the time. And this is why part of the reason they were so hated and misunderstood, what they believed just didn't make sense. The letters and the teachings that circulated among the people of the movement taught them that suffering was a part of life and that it was just something to be expected. Their letters taught things like, and not only that, but we also boast in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance, and endurance produces character, and character produces hope, and hope does not disappoint us, because God's love has been poured into our hearts through the Holy Spirit that has been given to us. It also said things like, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of any kind, consider it nothing but joy, because you know that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its full effect, so that you may be mature and complete, lacking in nothing. So the movement had its foundation in expected suffering. And not only that, they didn't believe that it was God that enacted the suffering. Unlike most of the religions during the day, the people of the movement believed that they were actually loved by God, not because of something that they did or something that they didn't do, not because of sacrifices, not because of some sort of exchange system between humanity and God, simply because God cared about them and God chose to love them like a mother or a father might love their child. So because of these things, ancient historians think that when disasters struck, the people of the movement were a little bit better set up to cope with it because it wasn't something unexpected and it wasn't something that they had to explain away. Not only that, the people of the movement had this strange belief that the way that they showed that they loved their God, the way that they pleased God, was to love other people. Their teacher, who they followed, had spent his life on earth serving people, choosing to be last. It didn't make sense. Sociologist Rodney Stark puts it this way: as God demonstrates his love through sacrifice, humans must demonstrate their love through sacrifice on behalf of one another. Moreover, such responsibilities were to be extended beyond the bonds of family and tribe. These were revolutionary ideas. In other words, to be a good member of the movement meant self-sacrifice, and it meant taking responsibility for the well-being of other people, even if those people weren't a part of the movement themselves. So, during things like epidemics, the people of the movement believed that it was their imperative to care for one another, to care for the sick, as a lot of their papers that they were reading, their teachings they had reading said things like, I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Truly, I tell you, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. So, while the movement didn't understand the science behind the epidemic, and they didn't particularly think that they were especially immune to the epidemics, they did feel that it was their job, their duty, to assist the sickened and the poor and the dying and those that had been left behind by other people fleeing the cities and fleeing the epidemics. And so that did have some effect on saving lives. Even basic medical science now would tell us that if you stay with someone who can't take care of themselves and offer them food and water, then they have a better likelihood of not dying. Mortality rates decrease. So of course, we can't say that the nursing of the people by the people of the movement had a drastic outcome on the numbers of people that died during the epidemics. They did, however, keep a lot of the people within the movement alive, but more than that, they changed perspectives of the people outside the movement. So when these epidemics passed, people had lost significant ties to people because they had left or they had died, and they didn't have community. And they were aware of how the movement had taken care of people during the worst of times, and they had few people to go back to. They also, the social stigma, because of the way that the world had changed and the society had changed, a lot of the social stigma of being a part of the movement, a lot of the dangers of being a part of the movement had been removed a little bit. And so people began joining, and the movement grew, not because of force and not because of might. And I wonder how the terms church, Christian, Christianity would have been defined during this time. Well, eventually, culture and politics took over the movement again. And by this time, the movement had an official name, you probably guessed it, Christianity. And a man named Constantine had a vision. Visions had a lot more power at that time, and people believed in what they said. And he believed that he had a vision that he was going to conquer the lands around him under the symbol of the people of the movement of Christianity, which was the cross. Constantine wanted more power. Constantine wanted his dream to come true. So he painted the cross on weapons and war flags, and he went to war, and he succeeded, and he became emperor. And I wonder again how people would have defined our three terms when this was happening. So even though Constantine was emperor, he ruled a really divided country because unlike our unified country and time when we all agree on everything, people during this time disagreed on almost everything, especially religion. Constantine understood that Christianity believed in the worship and the belief of one God. So his thinking was, well, if I can make everybody follow this one God, that will bring unity to my people, and that would make his job a lot easier. That was his ticket to success. So he passed a law, and he said that it was the official religion of the land. And so now people of the movement could officially practice. They could come out of hiding because being a part of the movement was kind of the cool thing to do. That's what was accepted. I wonder how people would have defined our terms then. This was almost 300 years after the very start of the movement. And as we said before, there was no set handbook. There was no set way to do this religion. It was a collection of letters and teachings that had spread throughout the land. And each Christian community had their own writings that they thought were authoritative. They had their own way of doing things. And even people that shared some of the same writings interpreted them very differently. So they just did their best with the teachings that they had from Jesus, and they determined how they were going to practice what he said. So finally, after Constantine said that Christianity was legal, men decided that this was their chance. Finally, they were going to put a stop to people making up their own minds about what they believed and determining how they were going to be followers of Jesus. So they did what we all do best. They had meetings and meetings and meetings. They called them councils, and there were 7 big ones in all. And really what they talked about was the nature of Jesus. Was he God? Was he man? Was he a God pretending to be a man? Was he man that was only just God for a little bit? How do we interact with Jesus? What does it mean to follow Jesus if Jesus was God and we're supposed to act like him? So eventually they settled on probably what we would consider bad math these days, that Jesus was 100% God and 100% man. Christianity was being officially defined at this point. But as you can imagine, not everybody agreed. Some didn't like the beliefs that they had decided on. Some didn't like the power that the church had grabbed in the midst of it becoming kind of this church state. And so they agreed to disagree, and they had lunch and they moved on. No, they didn't. They argued and they argued and they split. They couldn't even agree to disagree on things. There were too many lines that had been drawn. There were too many hurt feelings that had happened. And so they became various branches of Christianity, all with the foundation and the belief of Jesus, but with slightly different takes on what it meant to practice, on what you should believe, what was appropriate beliefs, all of those things. And by this point, Western Christianity and politics were very, very well entwined. And the Western bishop, the bishop of the Western Church, the Pope, had so much power by that point that an emperor couldn't even be an emperor without his approval. The Pope even had the power to send people to war, and he did it. And for 150 years, Christians fought battles across the land that we now call the Crusades, and they were trying to gain access and authority and sovereignty over the city of Jerusalem, which at the time 2 other religions, Judaism and Islam, claimed was their own as well. So they eventually gave up on the idea, but they left death and destruction in the wake of all their battles, and they gained very little from it. And after 150 years of fighting, not much had really changed. The movement looked so different than it had from its humble beginnings. And I wonder how it would have been defined at this point after the Crusades. This movement that had begun as this protest movement of love and service, its leaders now, all they wanted was more power and more wealth. That was their biggest concern. And it was clear that something had gone terribly, terribly wrong with it. And the military, it wasn't the only way where religion and power interacted. Church leaders held almost exclusive knowledge. They held power over all of the things to know about religion. So remember way back when people were allowed to interpret things for themselves? Not anymore. Church services were held exclusively in Latin, which was a problem because most people didn't even speak Latin anymore. But they were basically just required to go to church if they were going to fit into society and listen to a bunch of stuff that they didn't understand. And there were a few people that could read, but even those who could read couldn't read the scriptures because it was written in, you guessed it, Latin. So the people had to believe whatever religious leaders told them to believe. And everybody was expected to be a Christian with these very strict guidelines of what you were to believe and not to believe and who you were to accept and who you weren't supposed to accept. The religious leaders also realized how much power they actually had. And they liked it. And they realized they could benefit for this kind of power. So they took it to a next level and started charging people for the forgiveness of their sins. They called these indulgences. Once again, new definitions of church, of Christianity, of Christian. Well, after a while, the people began to protest the abuses of power. They called for reform, for leaders to listen to the people. They called for systematic change. Does this language sound familiar at all? The religious leaders, of course, didn't like this. And they thought it was a threat to their own power. And so they silenced the protesters. They silenced the reformers by threatening their lives, by imprisoning them, by ruining their reputations, by killing them in all manner of horrible ways, beheadings and burnings at the stake. It was time to redefine what Christianity meant. And years passed. More and more people began to take a stand against the corrupt practices of the Western Christian church. Protests began again, and a man named Martin Luther put 95 theses or reasons on the door of a church stating what was wrong with the church and what needed to change. 2 of them being the fact that people no longer had personal access to God or to Scripture. He was excommunicated. But the movement grew and church reform started to stick. And the people who protested against these systematic abuses, against the power and the corruption of the church, and then by extension the state, they were the protesters, the Protestants. But even the Protestants couldn't agree on what to agree on. What was more important? The Bible? Communion? Baptism? The community? Is art and music and dance allowed in the church, or is that a distraction? What should the power structure of the church be? How should we set up our sanctuaries? All of these things were contentious topics. And somewhere along the line, the early beliefs of the movement had been lost. The belief that it wasn't doctrine and theology that pleased God, but it was the loving and the serving of others. Protestantism spread, as we know, to the New World, where we are today, the United States. But the protests have never ceased. There are endless variations of Protestantism, Baptists and Methodists and Quakers and Shakers and Lutherans and even Latter-day Saints. All of these are Protestant movements. These are protest movements starting something else. So according to the Pew Research Center, There are over 200 main Protestant denominations in the United States. These are unique denominations. However, there are more than 33,000 independent, non-denominational churches, each claiming a varying belief, practices, a combination of beliefs, ecclesiology, all of those things. 33,000. Take a look at the notes that you had from the beginning. What is the definition of church, of Christianity, of Christian? What did you say about them? What has history said about them? What are we saying about us now? So often we forget that we're not simply snapshots in current history. Our religion, our beliefs, our stories, our practices, they don't exist in a vacuum. Sometimes what we claim as orthodoxy, those theological hills that we want to die on so often, have never been as big of a deal as we thought they were. Yes, the movement has grown and it has changed, and that is sometimes really good, but we have to take a look at where we came from, where we are now, and what that means for where we're going. Because sometimes it means that we've chosen to look more like power than we've chosen to look like love. Crosspointe is a non-denominational church, and we fit within that protest movement. And our history extends well beyond what any of us here or Crosspointe's founders could ever remember. For example, the Bible translations we use today, maybe you're holding one in your hand. People were beheaded so that you could have it and choose which one to read. Did you ever get baptized and choose immersion or sprinkling? People protested so that you could do that and not be murdered because of it. And this is just our Western European Christian heritage. There are people that call Crosspointe home who don't come from European heritage, and their Christian story is rich and deep and a part of our community all as well. And likewise, we're a part of this whole historical protest movement. We are a part of a movement where the participants in that movement chose to give of themselves and to side with the weak and those without a voice rather than to side with the powerful. And sometimes we got those things confused. They offered to love other people and serve other people because they believed that's how you showed love for God. And at Crosspointe, we think that being a part of this movement is spending money to pay bills for young men who have lost their homes during COVID. We believe it's paying medical bills and car bills and insurance. We believe that it is paying for scholarships for the YMCA, kids to go to the YMCA school so their parents can work. We believe that it's starting a food pantry. We believe that being a protest movement is listening to the voices of our LGBTQ siblings when they are not being heard. We believe that it's being a part of the movement and the practice of becoming anti-racist. We are people of the movement. We participate in the protest movement when we speak up for those who don't have a voice, when we speak up for those who have been excluded from our societal systems, just like those at the beginning of the movement. We participate in the movement when we take time to realize that those of us who can afford to feed our children, who can afford to take them to the doctor, who can afford to give them education outside of public schools, we're at the top of the ones with power, not at the bottom. The movement of Christ is a protest movement. From its first days of radical inclusion to the protests against unbridled power. It's always been that. Sometimes that meant that we've marched, and sometimes that's meant that we've paid bills, and sometimes that means that we've nursed people back to health. And when we look at history, I'm always surprised that we're not living in that unprecedented of a time. We're living in a really difficult time. We're in a global pandemic. There have been epidemics. There are protests. There have been and will be protests. This is nothing new. But like the people that came before us, we have to decide how we're going to respond to that. Are we a people who are more worried about right doctrine or about people? Are we more worried about being aligned with power or with sacrificial love? Who are those among us who need to be included, that need to be spoken for, who need to be cared for? And I think my biggest question and my takeaway for today is, how is history going to look back and define us?
Thank you for joining us today, and welcome home. If you are in need of assistance during this crisis, please reach out at crosspoint.org/help.